just climbing on top of the table. I remember hugging him. I remember holding the back of his head where he'd been shot with the shotgun, where he'd been hit there. Um, I remember grabbing him. I remember crying. I was crying and I couldn't stop crying. I know that, and I just kept holding him and people were pulling me off and eventually it came off. My name's Emmanuel Marley. My father is Lawrence Marley, who was shot dead by loyalists in Belfast on the 2nd of April 1987. I was 2 years of age. In 1972, my father went to prison. He was in prison up until 1975 when he escaped from Newry Courthouse. He, he ended up going on the run in Dundalk. 1976, my dad was arrested again. He was arrested in the M1 motorway on a motorbike. He got out the 16th of November 1985. He came in the house and we were all around him, we were all hugging him, we were grabbing him, we all wanted a bit of his attention. And and basically for me, it was every Christmas of my young life at that time rolled into one. It was everything I could have dreamed of. I think the two of them had enough of us running in. We used to just burst in the door in the morning, Dave on top of the bed, on top of him on her. The next thing is we realised that there was bolts going on the doors, keep them out in the morning. It wasn't long after that, and it was a very short period of time. Within 2 months, he was arrested and took away to, I think it was Castlereagh interrogation centre for 7 days. He was been interrogated for 7 days. And basically from that period, he's arrested nearly every month. And whether it was 5 days, 7 days, it was fairly regular. Midway through 1986, they trailed him out through the front door. Me and Joe, the younger brother, out of the car. They threw us on the ground and put us on our backs and stood with their boots on our faces with their rifles on our heads. And they were hit my dad and they hit us a couple of slaps, but my dad was screaming, "Leave my children alone!" And they were on top of him and they were telling they were going to kill him, telling us they were going to kill him. I got off a bus from the Marcus from the boxing tournament was at, and a local Republican said the guy I was with, tell him he needs to get home. His dad's been shot. So I got up to the front door, and all I saw blood in the hall. And it was thick black. It was real dark blood. And as I went up, a cop where do you think you're going? I says, I live here. He says, no, you're not getting up here. And the next thing is he pushed me down the path, and I was enraged at this stage because I knew it was my dad's blood, and I lashed out and I then got you think you're tough at 16, but I remember getting a couple of slaps around the head, and was it that the cops were grabbing me by the throat and by the hair down the path, and it was local people run over and said, people from the street says, what do you think is they're doing? This is the man's son, for Jesus Christ, let him go. A doctor then came out and took us in their room, and he said to us, you're he says, he says, Mrs. Marley, would you sit down? And Ma wouldn't sit down. She says, no, what is it? What's wrong with him? And the next thing he says, your husband's dead. And at that point, I remember running out of the room and running towards where I'd seen him coming from. These doors open. And I remember running in, and I just saw my dad lying. Well, in terms of my dad was covered up to here in a white sheet. And I ran over, just climbed on top of the table. I remember hugging him. I remember holding the back of his head where he'd been shot with the shotgun, where he'd been hit there. I remember grabbing him. I remember crying. I was crying and I couldn't stop crying. I know that, and I just kept holding him and people were pulling me off, and eventually it came off. And my dad's body came home, which is Friday. The RUC and British Army just started appearing out of nowhere. There was throughout the area there was roadblocks, there was people being stopped, there was just every corner of our town. Our town's a very small area, but they were they had blocked it off. They were in and out, they were stopping cars coming in and out. The back of the house, there was 2 or 3 jeeps sitting in the back of the house. The steps go down just outside of Anna Gardens. There was 3 or 4 jeeps, and there was jeeps just circling each other up and down. And we were starting to panic, what was going on. Monday morning, we knew things weren't going to go the way that you would want any funeral to go. We knew there was going to be problems. British Army were right to the back fence of the house. They were actually climbing over the fence into the garden. They were shouting obscenities at the brothers. They were torturing Ma. They were shouting like, where's Larry now? You know, all these type of things. We're seeing people who tortured him, and you were panicking. You were really frightened. You were going, at this stage, even in my head, you know, my dad's in the coffin, and I'm going to myself, don't want anybody to hurt my dad. He's dead, but you know, in your head, you're just, things aren't right. You know, you're grieving, but it's still too traumatic even to take in. My dad's coffin was brought out in the street, and I remember standing in the street and placed the tricolour on it and sort of then put the burying gloves on. I remember these RUC sort of were coming up, they come up the steps, started baiting people out of the way, and they made their way through, and they got up, and I remember this guy sort of, what he said was, you can't have that, that can't go on that coffin, and he reached over to try and grab the burying gloves. And the RUC then came in, they started baiting people. Just the viciousness of the character. I've seen people been bait with batons and everything else, sort of, you know, who hasn't, if you're from our doing. But this was vicious. It was, we're going to teach this community a lesson, we're going to bait these ones. And they're women, kids, didn't matter what was in their way, they were hitting them. We got the coffin back in the house, we just roused the coffin in the house, and basically the doors were locked, and the sort of, from that day to that night, and that's what it was like. It was guarding the coffin, it was make sure there's people there to guard that coffin, make sure, you know, they'll take Larry, they'll steal Larry, they'll take his body and bury him in some bog. The funeral itself, the actual funeral lasted 3 full days. You had the Monday in terms of where we tried to bury my dad, unsuccessfully because the British wouldn't move, the RUC wouldn't move. You then had the Tuesday where people were beat off the street again, similar to the Monday. And then Wednesday where we actually buried him. The burial itself was, I would say, very traumatic for anybody. I imagine it's for anybody who's lost someone in terms of that, whatever circumstances. It's the end of it. You know, once they go down that hole, it's over. It's, you know that person's gone. They're not coming back. And for me, it was fairly traumatic to see him going down. Basically, us as a family, my man and the brothers, we had literally 16 months with him when he came home. And as I've said, sort of, to anybody I know, in terms of the greatest period, in terms of the most happiest period I know in terms of my childhood, in terms of my life, was actually having him home for that period of time. But he did promise, the things that he did promise is when he was in jail, he'd tell us that he'd take us out and sort of he'd get us fishing, he'd take us out to do this, that and the other, whether it be getting a motorbike. Well, he did those things. He got us a 50cc sort of Yamaha, and he took us up the Bone Hills, up the sort of the Bone area, and he near killed a few of us sort of going around the Bone Hills on this big. But the thing is, the man himself, the crack out of him was huge for those 16 months. It was basically the happiest time that I knew growing up, because sort of him and Mary were together, and I knew that she'd been waiting for this day, for that period, and sort of we as brothers did too. I just wish that Shatanta would have knew him, sort of in a, you know, for a longer period, or even had some sense of the man that he was, and hopefully he does know that today, you know. But